Call her Linda. She's paid every bill in her household for 19 years. Her husband, Pete, has never once logged into their bank account. Last spring, Linda started seeing a therapist, and the first thing she said had nothing to do with money. You'd assume she was burned out from spreadsheets, or stressed about a specific expense, or worried they weren't saving enough. None of that. What she actually said is the real subject of this video, and it doesn't come up until later. But once you hear it, you'll understand why being the responsible one in a relationship can quietly cost a person something that has nothing to do with money management at all, and why the cost builds so slowly that neither person in the relationship usually notices it until it's already substantial. This is a composite story built around a dynamic that comes up constantly in conversations about household finances. Linda and Pete married in their late 20s. Early on, the division of labor made obvious sense. Linda had grown up in a household where money was a source of constant tension. Her parents argued about late fees regularly. She remembered the specific sound of those arguments, the kitchen table, the stack of envelopes, the raised voices over something that seemed like it should have been manageable. By the time she was in her teens, she'd developed an almost reflexive vigilance around due dates and account balances, a coping response to the anxiety of watching her parents struggle. Pete, by contrast, had grown up in a household where money was simply handled by someone else, his mother, without drama or discussion. He'd never been taught much about the mechanics of it, and when he and Linda got together, and it became clear that she had a system and enjoyed having a system, handing it off felt natural. For the first few years of their marriage, this arrangement worked exactly as intended. One person handled it, did it well, and the other trusted that it was handled. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? It was working. The bills were paid, the accounts were fine, the household ran smoothly. Here's what nobody clocks in year 1 or year 5, or sometimes even year 10. An arrangement that starts as a practical division of labor doesn't stay static, it calcifies. By year 10, Linda wasn't just paying bills, she was the only person in the household who knew which subscriptions had quietly crept up in price over the past 18 months. She was the only person who knew which accounts were nearing a threshold that triggered a fee. She was the only person who knew when the property tax bill was due relative to the car insurance renewal, and why those two landing in the same month mattered. She was the only person who knew what the actual monthly number was that their household needed to stay above to avoid any real stress. None of this was written down anywhere Pete could see because there was no particular reason to write it down. No system required his input. It all lived in Linda's head, continuously, running in the background whether she was thinking about it on purpose or not. At work, at dinner, lying awake at 2 a.m. after a long day. Always there, always tracking. There's a term for what Linda was doing that comes up increasingly in relationship and family research, often borrowed from the broader concept of household mental load, financial vigilance as a form of invisible cognitive labor. It's worth being precise about what this means because it gets confused with financial literacy or skill, and those are genuinely different things. Pete could have learned to log into their bank account in an afternoon. He could have learned to read a statement, set up bill pay, track a budget. Those are learnable skills. What he couldn't easily absorb, what he had no framework for understanding from the outside, was the ongoing background process nature of what Linda was actually doing every single day. The constant low-level tracking that doesn't show up as a task on a list because it never stops long enough to become a discrete task. The way knowing that a particular account had crept up in fee structure 6 months ago is a piece of information you can only have if you were paying attention 6 months ago and have been holding it in working memory ever since. Being good at handling money and being the only person in a household who handles money are two genuinely different things. The first is a skill. The second is a role, and the role carries a kind of weight that the skill, on its own, doesn't. The moment this invisible weight became visible to Linda, rather than just exhausting in a way she'd normalized, happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. She was going through their monthly bank statement, something she did every month, and she noticed a recurring charge from a streaming service neither of them had used in over a year. $12 a month, 14 months, $168, quietly gone. It wasn't the money that stopped her. They could absorb $168 without any real difficulty. What stopped her was the sudden sharp clarity of the thought that followed. She was the only person who would ever have noticed this. Not because Pete was careless, but because he was simply never looking. The financial picture of their household existed entirely inside her head, and if she stopped looking, even briefly, it would simply go unmonitored. Not badly managed, not mismanaged, just unmonitored by anyone other than her, permanently, with no end date she could see. This pattern is recognized widely enough that it gets discussed under the same umbrella as the broader mental load concept, which has been studied in the context of household chores and childcare for decades. The core finding is consistent. In many households, one partner carries the ongoing cognitive tracking of everything that needs to happen, even when the actual tasks are shared. The other partner executes tasks when asked or when they're made visible, but doesn't carry the background awareness of what needs doing next, what's been missed, what's about to need attention. Financial vigilance appears to work the same way. One partner manages the visible tasks, pays the bills, files the taxes, calls the insurance company. The other partner benefits from those tasks being done, but the first partner also manages the constant invisible meta layer underneath those tasks, the awareness of what tasks exist, when they're due, what happens if they're missed, and how all of it fits together into a coherent picture of the household's financial health. That meta layer is rarely discussed directly because it's rarely visible, which is exactly why it tends to produce resentment slowly, quietly, and in ways that neither person can easily name until it's been building for years. Here's the part that matters to say clearly, because it's easy for this kind of story to sound like an indictment. Pete wasn't lazy. He wasn't deliberately checked out. He wasn't taking advantage of Linda or making a conscious choice to let her carry everything. He genuinely didn't know what he didn't carry, because the entire point of invisible labor is that it's invisible to the person who isn't doing it. From where Pete sat, their household ran smoothly. The bills were paid on time. They'd never had a financial crisis. They had savings. Things worked. He had no mechanism for perceiving the constant background vigilance that made all of that smoothness possible, because that vigilance, by its nature, doesn't announce itself when it succeeds. It only becomes visible when it fails. And in 19 years, it had never failed, because Linda had never stopped. He would have been genuinely stunned to learn that she felt unseen inside this role, because from his vantage point, everything was fine. That gap between her experience and his perception is exactly what made it so difficult for either of them to address. What Linda told her therapist in that first session wasn't about money. It wasn't about Pete. It wasn't even really about the bill paying specifically. She said she felt like she had gradually disappeared inside a role that nobody had ever explicitly asked her to take on. Nobody had ever formally thanked her for, and nobody had ever offered to share or relieve. A role she wasn't entirely sure she'd consciously chosen anymore, because it had started so organically, in such a reasonable and practical way, so long ago, and had just quietly kept absorbing more weight every year without any single moment, when she could have pointed to the shift and said, "This is when it became too much." She wasn't angry at Pete. She wasn't, in that moment, even thinking about Pete specifically. She was simply exhausted by being the only person in their household who held the whole financial picture at once, in her head, all the time. And she was deeply unsure how to describe that exhaustion in a way that would make sense to anyone else, because from the outside, What she was doing looked like paying bills, and she couldn't figure out how to explain that it wasn't really about the bills at all. The fix, when it came, wasn't splitting every financial task down the middle 50-50. That kind of even redistribution can sound fair in theory, but it often creates more friction in practice than it resolves, because it requires rebuilding an entire system from scratch, rather than addressing the actual problem, which wasn't that Linda was doing too many tasks. It was that she was the only person carrying the awareness. On her therapist's suggestion, they started smaller. Linda and Pete built a shared financial dashboard together one afternoon, just a simple document listing every account, every recurring charge, every bill and its due date, every threshold worth watching, something Pete could look at and understand without needing to take over the tracking himself. It wasn't designed to transfer the work. It was designed to transfer the knowledge. And then Pete took ownership of 2 or 3 specific things, not assigned by Linda, but chosen by him. Things he would be fully responsible for remembering and handling without being reminded. Not an even split of hours. An even split of who held the awareness that the household's finances were being watched. That's what Linda had actually been asking for, even before she had words for it. Not for Pete to suddenly become a different person, not for a rebalancing of every task on a spreadsheet, just for someone else to know what she knew, for the weight of being the only person tracking the whole picture to stop sitting entirely and exclusively on her shoulders. Once Pete could see the same dashboard she'd been carrying silently in her head for 19 years, something shifted between them that had nothing to do with the math. She wasn't invisible anymore inside her own household, not because Pete started paying every bill, but because he started paying attention. That was the thing she'd needed, not the task, the witness. If you're the responsible one in your relationship, the fix usually isn't redistributing every task evenly. It's making the invisible vigilance visible to the other person, so that what you've been carrying alone stops being something only you know exists. If you're the partner who hasn't been carrying it, the ask isn't to take over. It's to look, to know, to share the awareness even if you don't share every task. This is for educational and entertainment purposes, not personalized financial or relationship advice. Every household is different. There's a video on this channel that walks through exactly how to build that kind of shared visibility together, starting with one conversation tonight.